The wind howled like a hungry beast outside Daniel Holt's cabin, rattling the wooden walls with icy fingers. The old ranger leaned back in his worn-out chair, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, watching the flames dance in his stone fireplace. Nights in the Montana wilderness were long, dark, and merciless. The snowstorm outside had been raging for hours, and he figured nothing but the most desperate creatures would dare venture out in this brutal cold. Then he heard it, a soft, deliberate scratch against the door. Daniel stiffened. His first thought was coyotes, maybe a desperate fox scrounging for scraps, but something about the sound made his gut tighten. It wasn't the frantic clawing of a scavenger, but something patient, persistent. Slowly he stood, setting his mug aside. The old cabin creaked as he moved, each step heavy against the wooden floor. He reached for the shotgun propped against the wall, not out of fear, but habit. Out here, caution was survival. Another scratch followed by a low, almost pleading whine. Daniel's brow furrowed as he reached for the doorknob. He cracked it open, the icy wind immediately slashing at his face, sending a flurry of snow spiraling inside. His breath caught in his throat. Two wolves stood on his porch. Their fur was thick but matted with snow, their ribs subtly outlined beneath their coats. The larger of the two, with dark gray fur and piercing amber eyes, stood protectively in front of the other, who was noticeably smaller and favored one leg, a dark stain of dried blood visible on its hind limb. Daniel's grip on the doorknob tightened. Wolves. Instinct screamed at him to shut the door. Wolves were predators, wild, untamed creatures that had no place inside a man's home. But then he met their eyes. The larger one stared at him, not with aggression, not with the glint of a hunter, but with something almost desperate. The smaller wolf trembled, barely able to stay upright in the storm's fury. They were starving and injured. Daniel exhaled, his breath a thick mist in the freezing air. Everything in him warned against this. Bringing wild predators into his home, it was madness, but these weren't ordinary circumstances. The smaller wolf took a shaky step forward, then collapsed onto its side with a soft whimper. "Damn it," Daniel muttered. Against all logic, against every survival instinct in his body, he stepped aside and opened the door wider. The larger wolf hesitated, eyes darting between Daniel and the warmth inside. Then, as if coming to a silent decision, it nudged its injured companion forward. The moment their paws crossed the threshold, a deep shiver passed through both animals. The cold seemed to finally lose its grip on them as they took their first steps into safety. Daniel shut the door against the raging storm, sealing them all inside. The cabin fell into an eerie silence. Only the sound of the crackling fire and the faint whimpers of the smaller wolf filled the space. Daniel kept his distance, watching them from the other side of the room, his grip still loose around the shotgun. The larger wolf, clearly the stronger of the two, stood alert, its amber eyes fixed on him. Not aggressive, but wary, protective. Daniel knew enough about wolves to recognize the dynamic. A bonded pair, possibly siblings or even mates. Wolves didn't abandon their own unless there was no choice. Slowly he moved to his small kitchen, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He grabbed a metal bowl, filled it with water, and carefully slid it across the floor toward them. The larger wolf didn't move at first. Then, after a long, tense moment, it lowered its head and sniffed the bowl. Deciding it was safe, it nudged the injured wolf toward it. The smaller one barely had the strength to drink. It lapped at the water weakly, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. Daniel noted the dark gash along its leg. Not fresh, but bad enough that infection was a real threat. Daniel sighed. "You're really doing this, huh?" Standing, he walked toward his supply cabinet, pulling out an old first aid kit he hadn't touched in years. The larger wolf's ears perked up instantly. A low rumble built in its throat, a warning. Daniel stopped, held up his hands. "Easy," he murmured, his voice calm even. "I'm not gonna hurt your friend. Just need to clean that up." The wolf didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. Slowly, Daniel knelt beside the injured one. It flinched but was too weak to resist. With steady hands, he dampened a cloth with warm water and began gently wiping the wound. The wolf let out a soft whimper, but didn't snap or pull away. The larger wolf stepped closer. Daniel tensed, feeling the heat of its breath against his shoulder. One wrong move, and it could sink its teeth into his arm in an instant. But it didn't. It just watched, guarded, yet allowing. Trust. A fragile, delicate thing. After wrapping the wound with a clean bandage, Daniel sat back on his heels. The injured wolf's eyes fluttered closed, its body sagging into the warmth of the fire. The larger one finally relaxed, giving Daniel a long, unreadable stare before settling down beside its companion. For the first time that night, Daniel allowed himself to breathe. "Guess we're doing this," he muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. "Hope you two don't eat me in my sleep." The larger wolf merely blinked, then curled around the smaller one protectively. Daniel watched them for a long while. Two wolves, beaten by the elements, now seeking refuge in a human's cabin. A story no one would believe. As the storm raged, on outside, the three of them sat in quiet truce, the fire their only witness. Little did Daniel know this was only the beginning. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows against the wooden walls of the cabin. Outside, the storm showed no signs of relenting. Winds howled through the trees, snow battered the windows, and the world beyond remained an impenetrable void of white. Inside, however, a fragile peace had settled. Daniel sat in his worn-out chair, his gaze fixed on the two wolves lying near the fire. The larger one, ever watchful, had finally allowed itself to rest, though its ears twitched at every sound. The smaller wolf lay curled against its sibling, its breathing shallow but steady. The bandage Daniel had wrapped around its injured leg had stayed in place, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. If infection set in, the wolf might not make it, and that left him with a problem. Daniel was no stranger to wildlife. He had spent years as a ranger, encountering everything from grizzlies to mountain lions, but never had he found himself sharing a living space with two apex predators. Even in their weakened state, they were still wild animals, unpredictable, dangerous. What happens when the storm clears? Would they leave peacefully? Would their instincts reignite, making him just another threat in their eyes? Or worse, what if the wolves decided they liked the warmth and food too much to go back? Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. He knew he had a choice to make. He could drive them out, let nature take its course, as cruel as that may be. The larger wolf might survive, but the smaller one, it was too weak. He could keep them inside, tend to their injuries, and hope they didn't turn on him. Neither option sat well with him. His thoughts were interrupted by movement. The larger wolf lifted its head, staring at him with piercing amber eyes. Its gaze was unreadable, filled with an intelligence Daniel couldn't quite place. "I know," Daniel muttered. "I don't like this either." The wolf didn't react, didn't snarl or growl, just kept staring. Daniel sighed, pushing himself out of the chair and heading toward the small pantry near the kitchen. He rummaged through the shelves, pulling out what little meat he had left. Venison jerky, a few cuts of frozen rabbit, and some leftover stew from the night before. Not enough for three. He hesitated before slicing off a portion of the dried meat and tossing it onto a metal plate. The sharp clang made the larger wolf's ears perk up. Slowly, it stood, stepping toward the plate with cautious grace. It sniffed once, then glanced. A Daniel test. Daniel stepped back, giving it space. After a beat, the wolf lowered its head and devoured the food in swift, precise bites. The smaller wolf stirred, sniffing the air but lacking the strength to stand. The larger one noticed, pausing briefly before nudging the last piece of meat toward its injured companion. Daniel watched in quiet amazement. Even in desperation, it was willing to share. His decision was made. "Fine," he muttered, crossing his arms. "You can stay, but this isn't permanent." The larger wolf merely blinked before returning to its place beside its sibling. But the relief Daniel felt was short-lived, because then came the scratching at the window. Daniel froze. It was faint, almost lost to the wind, but it was there. A distinct, deliberate scrape against the glass. His heart kicked against his ribs. Not the storm, not a branch. Something was out there. The larger wolf's ears snapped up, its body tensing, eyes locked onto the window. The smaller wolf let out a faint whimper but didn't move. Slowly, Daniel grabbed his shotgun. He approached the window, careful not to make a sound. The frost on the glass made it nearly impossible to see, but he could just make out a shadow moving beyond the tree line. It wasn't a bear, too small. Not a deer either. Then the wind shifted. For a split second, Daniel caught a clear silhouette, a human. His grip on the shotgun tightened. Who the hell would be out here in this storm? Daniel barely had time to process the thought before the knocking started. 3 solid raps against the wooden door. The larger wolf growled, a low, menacing rumble that sent chills down Daniel's spine. The smaller wolf stirred, its ears flicking up despite its weakened state. Daniel's gut told him to ignore it, but instinct and curiosity were 2 different things. Gun in hand, he approached the door and called out, "Who's there?" Silence. Another knock. His pulse pounded in his ears. He unlatched the door and cracked it open just enough to see. A woman stood there, bundled in thick winter gear, her face partially obscured by a scarf and hood. Her blue eyes were sharp, alert, and filled with urgency. "Are they inside?" she asked. Daniel blinked. "What?" "The wolves," she said, peering past him into the cabin. "Did you take them in?" His breath hitched. How the hell did she know about them? "Who are you?" Daniel demanded. She pulled down her scarf, revealing flushed cheeks and chapped lips. "Tess Monroe, I'm a wildlife biologist. I've been tracking those wolves for 3 days." Daniel's grip on the shotgun slackened slightly, but he didn't. "Lower it, I need to see them," Tess insisted. "The smaller one, does it have an injury on its hind leg?" Daniel hesitated. The larger wolf let out a sharp bark, standing between Daniel and the woman, its body rigid, protective. Tess didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed to understand the wolf's reaction. "I'm not here to hurt them," she said, keeping her voice steady. "They're part of a monitored pack. When they didn't return to their territory, we feared they were dead." She nodded toward the injured wolf. "That one's in bad shape, isn't it?" Daniel exhaled. "It won't last long without help." Tess nodded. "I have medical supplies. If we don't treat it now, it might not make it through the night." Daniel's thoughts raced. He had just barely convinced himself to let the wolves stay. Now a stranger was at his door, claiming to know them. Could he trust her? Could the wolves? The storm continued to howl outside, the world beyond still swallowed in snow. But inside the cabin, an entirely different kind of storm was brewing. Daniel had let the wolves in. Now the question was, would he let her in too? And if he did, would it be the right decision? The cabin had never felt smaller. Daniel stood near the door, shotgun still in hand, as Tess Monroe locked eyes with him. The storm outside roared against the walls, but inside, the real tension was the unspoken question hanging between them. Could he trust her? The wolves had already made their choice. The larger wolf stood protectively in front of the smaller one, amber eyes locked onto Tess with the same wary intensity it had given Daniel when he first let them in. Its muscles were tense, poised between defensive loyalty and exhausted uncertainty. The smaller wolf barely stirred, its injured legs stretched awkwardly beneath its body. "I don't have time to convince you," Tess said, voice firm but careful. "That wolf is on borrowed time. If we don't clean that wound properly, infection will set in. Once that happens, there's no saving it." Daniel's grip on the shotgun tightened. His instincts told him to be careful, but deep down, he already knew the truth. He wasn't equipped for this. Sighing, he nodded and stepped aside. "Close the door fast," he muttered. "You let in any more cold, and none of us are making it through the night." Tess didn't hesitate. She slipped inside and shut the door behind her in one swift motion, stamping the snow off her boots. As she pulled down her hood, Daniel got his first good look at her. She had sharp blue eyes, a wind-burned face, and an expression that spoke of equal parts exhaustion and determination. Her gaze went immediately to the wolves. "You weren't lying," she murmured, more to herself than to Daniel. "They really came to you." The larger wolf huffed, a warning sound, stepping slightly in front of its injured companion. Tess slowly reached into her bag, moving deliberately, aware of the eyes watching her every move. "I have antiseptic, bandages, and antibiotics. I just need to get close enough to check the wound." Daniel glanced at the larger wolf. Would it allow this? It had tolerated him, but Tess was new. And wolves, especially those bonded by survival, didn't take kindly to outsiders. "You're not going to be able to touch that wolf unless you earn its trust first," Daniel said. "You know that, right?" Tess nodded. "I know." And she did. Instead of rushing in, she lowered herself to the wolf's level, sitting cross-legged a few feet away from them. She unzipped her coat slightly, exposing the thick wool beneath it, making herself appear less imposing. Then she did something unexpected. She looked away, not out of fear, but out of respect. Daniel recognized it immediately. A ranger's trick. A hunter's discipline. A wolf's language. Direct eye contact was a challenge, a declaration of dominance. Wolves only maintained it when asserting control, warning an intruder, or preparing for battle. By avoiding their gaze, Tess was sending a different message. "I'm not a threat. I don't want to fight. I am here in peace." The larger wolf's ears flicked, its body still rigid, but it didn't growl. Instead, it sniffed the air. Tess remained still, letting the moment unfold naturally. Then, ever so slowly, she extended her hand, palm up, open and unthreatening. The larger wolf hesitated, then took a single step forward. Daniel's fingers twitched near his shotgun. He wasn't sure whether to admire her or call her crazy. Tess kept still, allowing the wolf to close the distance at its own pace. It sniffed her fingers once, then twice, then it exhaled softly. A test passed, a silent bond formed. Daniel exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. Tess finally glanced at him. "I think we're good." The larger wolf moved back beside its injured companion, resting beside it, but no longer standing guard. Tess wasted no time. "I need better light." Daniel grabbed an old lantern from the shelf, lighting it quickly. The glow bathed the cabin in a golden haze, illuminating the wolf's fur and the worn wooden walls. Tess unwrapped her first aid kit, laying out bandages, a small scalpel, antiseptic, and a syringe filled with antibiotics. Daniel crouched beside her. "What's the plan?" She gestured toward the injured wolf. "The wound needs cleaning first. I can't tell if the infection's already started, but if we're lucky it hasn't spread. I'll inject the antibiotic first, less painful, than applying it directly." Daniel nodded. "What do you need me to do?" She studied him for a moment, as if assessing whether she could trust him with this. Then she handed him a clean rag. "Keep its head calm," she said. "If it panics, it could lash out. The last thing we need is a bite wound in the middle of a storm." Daniel moved toward the wolf, his presence familiar enough now that it didn't flinch when he approached. He gently placed a hand on its thick fur, rubbing slow, comforting circles along its shoulder. The wolf's ears twitched, but it remained still. "Good," Tess murmured. She filled the syringe and carefully pressed it into the wolf's leg, injecting the antibiotic in one smooth motion. The wolf let out a faint whimper, shifting slightly, but Daniel's hand on its fur kept it steady. "That's it," Daniel said quietly. "Easy now." The larger wolf watched intensely, but didn't interfere. Tess worked quickly, cleaning the wound with warm water and antiseptic, dabbing away dried blood and dirt. The cut was deep but not fatal, likely the result of a territorial fight or a poorly placed trap. After wrapping the leg in clean bandages, she sat back and exhaled. "That should hold for now," she said. "We'll need to keep an eye on it for signs of fever or swelling. If it worsens, we'll have to find a way to get them to my facility." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan to move 2 wild wolves?" Tess gave him a small smile. "Same way you got them in here," Daniel snorted. "You think they'll just walk onto a snowmobile?" "They trusted you enough to come inside," she pointed out. "That means something." Daniel couldn't argue with that. The injured wolf had already settled back into sleep, exhaustion claiming it once more. The larger wolf relaxed, resting its head beside its companions, amber eyes half-lidded. Tess watched them in silence for a long moment before speaking again. "You saved their lives, you know." Daniel shook his head. "No, they saved themselves. I just left the door open," She glanced at him, studying the lines on his face, the quiet weight in his expression. "Maybe," she said, "but not everyone would have." Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the cabin a strange calm had settled. The wolves slept beside the fire, no longer just strangers, but something more, a part of the world Daniel had never expected to be connected to. A silent bond formed in the heart of a storm, and somehow he knew this was far from over. The wind outside had begun to shift, no longer howling like a wounded beast, but whispering in long, eerie gusts against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire had burned low, leaving behind a bed of smoldering embers. The warmth held, but Daniel couldn't shake the creeping chill in his gut, and it wasn't from the cold. He wasn't the only one feeling it. The larger wolf's ears twitched, its body stiffening as it lifted its head. Its amber eyes, which had finally softened in exhaustion, were now locked onto the frosted window. Something was out there. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. He glanced at Tess, who had noticed it too. She was still seated on the floor near the injured wolf, but her posture had changed, tense, alert. She didn't say a word. Didn't need to. They weren't alone. Daniel rose slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might spook the wolves. He reached for his rifle, not out of paranoia, but out of instinct. This deep in the Montana wilderness, things didn't just wander near cabins in the middle of a storm unless they had a reason, and whatever was out there had been watching for a while. He moved toward the window, stepping lightly to avoid creaking the old wooden floor. The frost-covered glass blurred the world beyond, making it hard to see past the glow of the firelight reflecting against it. But when he got close enough, he saw them. Tracks, leading from the tree line, half buried in the fresh snow. Daniel's grip on the rifle tightened. His mind immediately ran through possibilities: a coyote, a bear, another wolf. Tess rose quietly, moving toward him. "What do you see?" she whispered. Daniel exhaled through his nose, then reached out and wiped a section of the glass clear with his sleeve. The moment he did, his stomach dropped. A figure stood at the edge of the trees. Dark, motionless, watching. Tess must have seen the shift in his expression because she immediately stepped closer, following his gaze. She sucked in a sharp breath. "That's not an animal." Daniel didn't reply. He was already moving, throwing on his coat and reaching for the heavy flashlight. Near the door. "Wait," Tess whispered urgently, grabbing his arm. "You don't know who—" "I know I'm not waiting for them to make the first move." His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge of steel to it. The larger wolf stood, hackles raised, letting out a deep, low growl, not at Daniel, but at whatever was beyond that window. And then, before either of them could stop it, the wolf moved toward the door. Daniel cursed under his breath. He knew that kind of movement. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. The wolf knew whatever or whoever was out there, and that meant danger. The cold hit Daniel like a hammer the second he stepped outside. The wind had eased slightly, but the bite of the night air still cut through his layers as if he weren't wearing them at all. His boots crunched against the snow as he stepped off the porch, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. Tess followed, but she kept a few feet behind him, her breath coming out in short, visible puffs. The moment the flashlight beam hit the tree line, the figure moved. Not fast, not retreating, just shifting, like it wanted them to know it had seen them. Daniel aimed the light directly at it. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then, finally, it stepped forward. A man, bundled in thick winter gear, a fur-lined hood pulled low over his face. His clothes were practical, worn but sturdy, hiking gear, maybe military surplus. But what stood out most wasn't his clothing. It was the rifle slung over his shoulder. Daniel kept his own rifle low but ready. "You're a long way from town." His voice cut through the night, even over the wind. The man didn't respond right away. He took another slow step forward, and Daniel could just make out his face beneath the hood. Sharp features, eyes that glinted like frostbitten steel. "Funny," the stranger finally said, his voice gravelly and rough, as if he hadn't spoken in days. "I was about to say the same thing to you." Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. Something about this guy was off. "What do you want?" Daniel asked, keeping his stance firm. The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze flicking behind. Daniel, to the cabin, to the wolves. Tess must have noticed too, because she shifted uneasily beside him. "I saw the tracks," the man said. "Figured someone had taken them in." His voice was flat, emotionless. A chill, not from the wind, crawled up Daniel's spine. "How do you know about them?" The stranger let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Because I was tracking them before you." Daniel's grip on his rifle tightened. The larger wolf, still standing just outside the door, let out another low growl, stepping between Daniel and the man. Its body language wasn't just defensive, it was hostile, and that told Daniel everything he needed to know. The wolves recognized him, and not in a good way. Tess's voice was tense when she finally spoke. "Who are you?" The man's gaze flicked to her. "That's not important." "The hell it isn't." Daniel's voice was like iron now. The man exhaled, shifting his rifle just slightly, the movement subtle but not subtle enough. Daniel stepped forward. "I don't know what you think you're doing out here, but if you had anything to do with those wolves being injured, I wasn't the one who hurt them," the man cut in. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, the man took one step back. "But I am the one who wants them back." Daniel's stomach turned to ice. Tess inhaled sharply beside him. "They're not yours." The stranger smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Everything in these woods belongs to someone." Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the storm. Daniel stood frozen. For a long moment, rifle still raised slightly, mind racing. Tess exhaled shakily. "Who the hell was that?" Daniel didn't answer, because the real question wasn't who he was. It was when he was coming back, and next time, he wouldn't be alone. The man had vanished into the trees, swallowed by the storm, but his presence lingered like a ghost in the air. Daniel and Tess stood motionless in the snow, the weight of his words still hanging between them. "I am the one who wants them back." Daniel exhaled slowly, scanning the darkness where the stranger had disappeared. The cold gnawed at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was running in a dozen different directions, trying to piece together what the hell had just happened. Tess was the first to break the silence. "Daniel!" Her voice was tight, urgent. He turned to her, still gripping his rifle, his breath misting in the cold. "Yeah? We need to get inside. Now." She wasn't wrong. They were standing in the open, and if that man wasn't alone, or if he decided to double back, they were sitting ducks. Daniel gave one last glance toward the trees before nodding. "Move!" They hurried inside, the wind slamming the door shut behind them. The wolves were waiting. The larger one stood near the entrance, ears pinned back, tail stiff. It hadn't moved from its position outside earlier, but now, inside the cabin, the tension in its body was palpable. The smaller wolf was still resting, its breathing shallow but steady, but even it had lifted its head slightly, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "They know something's wrong," Tess murmured, brushing snow off her sleeves. Daniel set his rifle down but didn't stray far from it. "Yeah," he muttered, running a hand over his face. "So do I." He turned back to Tess. "You want to tell me what the hell that was about?" Tess crossed her arms, shaking her head. "I don't know, but I don't like it." Daniel frowned. "You said you've been tracking these wolves for days. You didn't run into anyone else out there?" "No," Tess said, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her expression. "At least, I didn't think so." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "What does that mean?" Tess hesitated. "It means I felt like I was being watched." Daniel stiffened. Tess sighed and ran a hand through her hair. "I chalked it up to paranoia. Being alone in a snowstorm will do that to you. But now," she shook her head, "now I think he's been out here longer than we realize." Daniel leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "And you don't recognize him at all?" "No," Tess admitted. But he knew about the wolves. He knew they were here. Daniel's jaw clenched, which means he's been close enough to see the tracks, maybe even close enough to watch me bring them inside. The thought sent a cold shiver down his spine. Tess paced the length of the cabin, arms folded tight across her chest. The way he was talking, it sounded like he thinks they belong to him. Daniel let out a humorless chuckle. "Wolves don't belong to anyone." "Exactly." Tess turned to face him. "So what does he want?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He glanced at the wolves. The larger one still hadn't relaxed, its sharp gaze flicking between them and the door. It was still waiting for something, or someone. Finally, Daniel sighed. "I don't know, but I'm not waiting around to find out." They moved quickly. Daniel checked every window, making sure the shutters were locked tight. The storm would cover their tracks eventually, but for now, they needed to be prepared in case the stranger wasn't alone, or worse, if he came back tonight. Tess dragged the heavy wooden table closer to the door, reinforcing it as best as they could. Daniel grabbed a handful of extra shotgun shells from a box near the fireplace. Loading his weapon with slow, practiced efficiency, Tess watched him. "You think he's coming back?" Daniel didn't look up. People don't just walk into the middle of nowhere in a storm unless they have a damn good reason. Tess swallowed. "And his reason is the wolves." Daniel snapped the barrel shut. "Looks that way." A long silence stretched between them. The fire popped and crackled, the only sound in the cabin apart from the wind howling outside. Tess glanced at the wolves again. "What if they know him?" Daniel turned to her, frowning. "What do you mean?" Tess hesitated, then nodded toward the larger wolf. "Look at it. It wasn't just growling at him. It was ready to fight. I've seen wolves act territorial before, but this..." She shook her head. "It's personal." Daniel followed her gaze. The larger wolf was still staring at the door, muscles coiled like a spring waiting to snap. He exhaled through his nose. She was right. "I think he's the reason they were running," Tess said softly. Daniel didn't doubt it. He looked at the smaller wolf, bandaged and weak, and felt something dark settle in his chest. Someone hurt them, and now that someone wanted them back. The night dragged on, thick with tension. Tess sat by the fire, flipping through the small field journal she carried in her pack. She jotted down notes, occasionally glancing at the wolves, checking on the injured one. Daniel sat near the door, rifle across his lap, listening. The storm was still raging, but every now and then the wind would shift just enough to make him wonder, was that the trees creaking, or was someone out there? The wolves were restless. The larger one kept pacing, ears flicking toward every small noise. The smaller one was still weak, but it was more aware now, lifting its head when Daniel moved. Tess sighed and stretched her legs. "So what's the plan?" Daniel shrugged. "Depends. What? On whether or not that son of a bitch is stupid enough to come back." Tess gave him a look. "And if he is?" Daniel met her gaze. "Then I stop him." The fire crackled between them. Tess didn't argue. It was sometime past midnight when it happened. Daniel had started to doze in his chair, rifle still across his lap, when a noise jerked him awake. A soft thump, like something heavy had landed. On the roof, Daniel's entire body went still. The wolves snapped awake, ears alert, bodies stiff. Tess's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" Another thump. Daniel shot to his feet, gripping his rifle. He motioned for Tess to stay low. The wolves were staring at the ceiling now, bodies rigid. The larger one let out a low, guttural snarl. Something was up there. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. Then came the sound that made his stomach plummet, the distinct creak of wood shifting under weight. And then, footsteps. Someone was on the roof. Daniel's grip tightened on the rifle. He took a slow step toward the door. Tess whispered, "Daniel." His jaw clenched. "Stay quiet," he murmured, "and get ready." The cabin had just become a trap, and they were stuck inside with whoever or whatever had come back for the wolves. Daniel stood frozen, rifle in hand, listening to the slow, deliberate footsteps on the roof. Whoever was up there wasn't in a hurry. The weight of each step sent a faint creak through the old wooden beams, the sound barely audible, over the wind. The wolves were motionless, ears pinned forward, bodies coiled in readiness. Tess crouched by the fireplace, her breathing shallow. "Daniel," she whispered, gripping a small hunting knife from her pack. He lifted a hand, signaling for silence. Outside, the storm raged, wind whistling through the trees. The cabin lights flickered from the gusts pushing against the old structure, but inside time stretched heavy with tension. Another footstep. Then, a pause. Whoever was up there was listening too. Then came the soft, unmistakable sound of something being unzipped. Daniel's blood went cold. A bag? A weapon? A long, slow dragging noise followed, something scraping across the roof. His instincts screamed at him. This wasn't just some drifter looking for shelter. This was planned. This was deliberate. Daniel adjusted his grip on the rifle. He knew his cabin well. The only way onto the roof was by climbing the old storage shed out back, which meant whoever this was had scouted the place beforehand. This was no coincidence. The wolves must have sensed the shift in his stance because the larger one moved first. It stepped toward the door, tail stiff, a deep snarl curling from its throat. Tess swallowed hard. "They know him," she murmured, "and they don't like him." Daniel exhaled through his nose. Good, because neither did he. Then, without warning, a loud crash. The entire cabin shook as something heavy landed near the back wall, sending a cloud of dust raining from the rafters. The larger wolf lunged toward the sound, barking viciously, claws scraping the wooden floor. The smaller one whined, trying to stand but too weak. Tess's eyes darted around. What the hell was that? Daniel was already moving. He grabbed the lantern and tossed it toward the back door, flooding the area with dim, flickering light. Then, in the half-lit glow, he saw it. A hole had been torn in the old wooden slats near the storage area. Snow was blowing in through the opening. Someone had jumped off the roof and was trying to force their way inside. Daniel swung his rifle up just as a shadow moved beyond the broken wood. A figure, shifting in the darkness. Then, a flash of steel. Something, small and sharp, whizzed past his face, embedding itself in the doorframe. A knife. Daniel didn't hesitate. He fired once, a deafening blast that shook the cabin. The bullet splintered the wood, missing the figure by inches. A grunt, then rapid footsteps retreating into the night. Daniel swore under his breath, already moving toward the door. But Tess grabbed his arm. "Wait, he's trying to lure you outside." Daniel's muscles tensed. He knew she was right. Whoever this was, they weren't alone. Then the worst thing happened. A whine. Daniel spun around just in time to see the larger wolf stepping toward the open hole. "No," Daniel hissed, reaching for it. "Don't." But it was already too late. The wolf leapt through the gap into the storm. Daniel didn't think, he acted. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, yanked the door open, and charged out into the snow after it. The wind was brutal, whipping ice and flakes into his face. The moment he stepped outside, he felt how exposed he was. Visibility was near zero, the moon barely cutting through the swirling snow. Tess was right behind him, knife in hand. "Daniel, this is crazy." He barely heard her, because he saw them. The larger wolf was circling a dark figure near the tree line, snarling furiously. The smaller wolf, still inside, let out a mournful howl, but the pack bond was too strong. The healthy one wouldn't abandon the fight. Daniel ran toward them, rifle raised. "Get away from the damn wolf!" The figure turned just enough for Daniel to see it. The same man from before. His hood was still up, snow clinging to his coat. But this time Daniel saw the glint of a gun in his hand. Time slowed. The man took aim. The wolf lunged. A shot rang out. Daniel fired at the same time, the storm swallowing the deafening sound. The stranger stumbled back, disappearing into the trees. His own shot went wide, missing the wolf completely. Daniel rushed forward, heart hammering. The wolf was still standing, unharmed. The man, however, was gone. Footprints led deeper into the woods, disappearing into the swirling white, but Daniel knew he'd be back. Tess reached his side, breathless. "Daniel, we can't stay here. He'll regroup." Daniel clenched his jaw, scanning the darkened tree line. He knew she was right. This wasn't over. But right now he had another problem. He turned back toward the cabin just as the smaller wolf let out a weak, pained cry. Daniel and Tess rushed inside. The injured wolf was worse. Its breathing was ragged, its head barely lifted when they entered. The stress, the cold, it had taken a toll. Tess knelt beside it, fingers pressing lightly against its ribcage. "We're out of time." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "Damn it." Tess looked up. "We have to move them now. We don't have a choice anymore." She was right. The cabin was compromised. They were being hunted. Daniel exhaled sharply. "We take my snowmobile. Head for your research station." Tess nodded. "Can it carry all of us?" Daniel's eyes flicked to the wolves. It's gonna have to. Within minutes, they were ready to move. Daniel secured the weaker wolf in a makeshift sled, bundling it in blankets. The larger wolf, sensing the urgency, didn't fight it this time. The snowmobile roared to life, its engine cutting through the storm. Tess climbed on behind Daniel, keeping her knife within reach. "Hold on," Daniel muttered, gripping the handles. "Because if that bastard comes back, we're not stopping." Then, with one last glance toward the tree line, Daniel gunned the engine. The snowmobile lurched forward, carving through the storm, carrying them and the wolves toward whatever waited for them beyond the wilderness, toward one final fight. The snowmobile roared through the night, its engine cutting through the howling wind like a defiant scream against the storm. Daniel gritted his teeth, gripping the handlebars tightly as they plowed through deep drifts, the sled behind them bouncing unevenly over the rugged terrain. Tess clung to his back, her arms locked around his waist. The wind was brutal, slashing across their faces like icy knives. Every breath stung, every second counted, and behind them in the darkness they weren't alone. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the man, that stranger, was still watching, maybe even following. He risked a quick glance over his shoulder, scanning the endless stretch of white behind them. Nothing. But he wasn't fooled. A hunter didn't make himself known until he was ready to strike. The larger wolf huddled close to its injured companion in the sled, its thick coat covered in frost. It watched Daniel, golden eyes unblinking, as if trying to understand the man who had now risked everything for them. The smaller wolf's breathing was shallow, its body curled in on itself. The antibiotics Tess had given it were keeping it stable, but it was losing too much heat. It wouldn't survive much longer out here. "We need to go faster," Tess shouted over the wind. Daniel grunted. "If I push this thing too hard, we risk flipping the sled." Tess didn't argue. She knew it was a gamble either way. The forest stretched ahead, dense and dark, its branches bending under the weight of fresh snowfall. Somewhere beyond that, Treeline was her research station, a small but sturdy outpost where they could finally get the wolves proper care. If they could make it in time. They had just crossed a frozen creek when it happened. The larger wolf's ears snapped forward, its head lifting sharply. A deep growl rumbled from its throat. Daniel felt it before he heard it, a distant crack. Then, another Tess tensed behind him. "That's gunfire!" A sharp whiz sliced through the air just behind them, striking the snowmobile's metal frame with a faint ping. Daniel didn't hesitate. He jerked the handlebars, sending them into a sharp, almost uncontrollable swerve to the left. The sled lurched. The wolves yelped as the snowmobile barely regained control before hitting a buried log. Tess twisted her head back. Where is he? Daniel's mind was already racing. The bastard was close enough to take a shot, and that meant he wasn't. Working alone, a sniper in a storm. No, someone was guiding him. Daniel clenched his jaw. Hold on. Then he gunned the engine. The snowmobile exploded forward, kicking up a thick wall of powder behind them. If they couldn't fight back, they could at least make it damn hard to hit them. The wolves stayed low in the sled, but Daniel caught a glimpse of the larger one baring its teeth, eyes scanning the trees, its instincts screaming the same truth Daniel already knew. They were being hunted. Tess leaned close. "We're less than a mile out." Daniel nodded, adjusting course. Say. Terrain was getting rougher, the incline steeper. He could already see the faint glow of the station's perimeter lights cutting through the storm. Then another shot. This time it hit the ground just to their right, sending up a spray of ice and dirt. Daniel cursed. Son of a sudden movement. To the left, a dark figure barely visible between the trees. The stranger. Daniel's gut twisted. The man was running alongside them, parallel to their path, trying to cut them off before they reached safety. "Daniel!" Tess shouted, "I see him." He yanked the snowmobile hard to the right, nearly toppling them as the sled skidded behind them. The station was so close now, just past the next ridge, but so was the stranger, and he was gaining. The larger wolf lifted, its head ears forward, staring at the stranger. And then, as if understanding exactly what was at stake, it leapt from the sled. "Tess!" Daniel barely had time to shout before the wolf hit the snow running, its powerful legs carrying it. Straight toward the man, Tess gasped. "No!" But there was no stopping it now. The stranger barely had time to react before the wolf was on him, a snarl, a cry, a flurry of snow and limbs. Daniel saw the rifle knocked away, heard the sounds of a struggle, but they couldn't stop. Not. Now, with a final burst of speed, Daniel and Tess cleared the ridge. The research station now fully visible ahead of them. The main doors were already opening. Her team had seen them coming. The moment they reached the station, Daniel hit the brakes, skidding to a halt in front of the entrance. Tess jumped off first, already shouting for help. The doors burst open, and two members of her team rushed out, one of them holding a medical bag, the other helping Daniel unfasten the sled. The injured wolf was barely conscious, its body limp. The moment the blankets were pulled away, the vet techs moved in, lifting it carefully and rushing it inside. Daniel turned back toward the trees, his chest tightened. The larger wolf wasn't there. His eyes scanned the dark, looking for any sign of movement. Tessa, her gaze followed his. She swallowed. "We have to go back for it." Daniel nodded, already turning toward the snowmobile. Then, a shape emerged from the tree line. Daniel froze. The larger wolf was limping toward them, snow clinging to its coat, breath visible in short, heavy bursts. Its mouth and fur were streaked with blood, not its own. Daniel's fingers twitched toward his rifle, but he stopped himself. The wolf's eyes met his. There was no aggression, no threat, just exhaustion, a silent understanding. Tess stepped forward carefully, crouching near the ground. "You made it," she murmured. The wolf took another shaky step forward, then another. Then it collapsed. Daniel moved instantly, kneeling beside it. Tess looked up at him, her expression clear. "We need to get it inside now." Inside the station, the injured wolf was already being treated, IV fluids dripping, careful hands cleaning its wounds. Daniel and Tess stood near the examination table, watching as the larger wolf was given its own medical check. It was bruised, battered, but alive. Tess exhaled, a slow, shaky breath. "They're safe now." Daniel looked at the wolves. The larger one shifted, lifting its head just enough to nuzzle the smaller one. The smaller wolf, despite everything, responded with a weak, grateful whimper. A pack, a family, reunited. Daniel felt something deep in his chest loosen, something he hadn't even realized he'd been holding. For the first time in days, he let himself breathe. But in the back of his mind, a single thought remained. The stranger was still out there. And this wasn't over. Not yet. The warmth inside the research station was jarring after the relentless cold of the storm. Daniel barely felt the heat, though. His focus was locked on the two wolves stretched out on examination tables, their fur damp with melting snow. The injured one, the smaller wolf, lay motionless, its chest rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. The larger wolf was curled up nearby, its golden eyes open, alert despite its exhaustion. It had fought for its pack, for survival. And now, so had Daniel. Tess and her team worked quickly and efficiently, moving between the two animals with a practiced urgency. IV drips were inserted, wounds cleaned, bandages re-wrapped. Soft murmurs of medical jargon filled the room, but Daniel barely registered the words. He just watched. His pulse still thundered in his ears. The adrenaline from the escape hadn't faded. The image of the stranger's rifle aimed at them in the storm still burned in his mind. They weren't safe. Not yet. Tess pulled off her gloves and exhaled. "The smaller wolf is stable for now," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "The antibiotics are kicking in and its body temperature is rising. That's the most important thing." Daniel nodded, his gaze flicking to the larger wolf. "And the other one?" Tess gave a tired smile. "Bruised, scratched, exhausted, but tough as hell." Daniel huffed a quiet breath. "Yeah, that tracks." For the first time in what felt like days, Daniel let himself sink into a chair. His muscles ached, his fingers still stiff from the cold. He rubbed his hands together, trying to shake the numbness from his skin. Tess sat across from him, wrapping her hands around a steaming mug of coffee. "You okay?" Daniel let out a short laugh. I don't even know how to answer that. She smiled, exhaustion softening her features. I get it. The station was quiet now, apart from the hum of the heaters running at full blast and the occasional beeping of medical monitors hooked to the wolves. The storm outside had begun to ease, but the tension in Daniel's chest hadn't, because he knew this wasn't over. The stranger hadn't given up. He was still out there, and something told Daniel he wasn't the kind of man to let loose ends go. Tess must have sensed his thoughts, because she leaned forward, lowering her voice. We need to figure out our next move, Daniel nodded. Agreed. But first I need to know something, Tess set her mug down. What? He leveled his gaze at her. Why do these wolves matter so much? Tess inhaled deeply, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. Then finally she spoke. They're the last of their pack. Daniel's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Tess glanced toward the examination tables, her expression unreadable. Their pack was part of a tracking program I was running. We were monitoring their movements, studying their hunting patterns. They were thriving. She hesitated, then added, until a few months ago. Daniel's gut tightened. What happened? Tess exhaled. They started disappearing. Silence stretched between them. Daniel understood exactly what that meant. He'd worked in the wilderness long enough to know that wolves didn't just vanish. Someone was taking them. And suddenly the stranger's presence made a lot more sense. You think he's been hunting them, Daniel said, more statement than question. Tess nodded, her jaw tight. Not just him. He's part of something bigger. Daniel felt a cold rage settle in his chest. Wolves were already on the brink in these parts. Hunted, poisoned, driven from their territories, and now someone was targeting them directly. Why? He asked. What's the angle? Tess hesitated. I don't know for sure, but I think they're being sold. Daniel frowned. Sold? For private collections, illegal breeding programs. Maybe even... She stopped herself, but Daniel could finish the thought. Maybe even for sport. The air between them felt heavier. Now, like the storm had moved indoors, Daniel clenched his jaw. He had spent his life in these wild places, protecting them, respecting the balance of nature. The idea of someone ripping that apart for money made his stomach turn. Tess leaned forward. That's why they ran, Daniel. Why they came to you, they escaped. Daniel exhaled, his mind racing. Then they're still in danger, Tess nodded. And so are we. Daniel stood, rolling the tension from his shoulders. We can't stay here. Tess looked up, surprised. What? If they were tracking? The wolves, then they know about this station. Daniel glanced at the radio on the wall, the only communication link to the outside world. It won't take them long to figure out where we went. Tess paled slightly. You think they'll come here? Daniel nodded. I don't think I know, Tess swallowed. So what do we do? Daniel's mind was already working through their options. We move the wolves, get them as far from here as possible. Tess frowned. Move them where? Daniel looked at her. A sanctuary, somewhere they can disappear. Tess hesitated, then nodded. There's one about 200 miles from here. It's in protected land, out of reach from anyone looking to claim them. Daniel considered. You trust the people running it? Yes, Tess said firmly. They're not just scientists. They're people like you who understand what's at stake. Daniel took a deep breath. Then that's where we're going. Tess rubbed her hands together, trying to warm them. How do we get there? We barely made it here in one piece. Daniel thought for a moment. Then a slow, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. We take the back roads. The next hour was a blur of preparation. Tess's team worked fast, packing the medical supplies they would need for the journey. Daniel checked the station's backup vehicle, an old but sturdy off-road truck built for rough terrain. The wolves would travel in the back, secured but comfortable. The larger wolf was already standing again, limping slightly but watching them closely, as if it knew what they were planning. It did. Daniel crouched beside it, resting a hand lightly on its thick fur. You ready for one more ride? The wolf blinked slowly. Daniel took that as a yes. Tess approached, pulling on her jacket. We need to leave before sunrise. Daniel stood, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "Then let's move." The truck's engine rumbled to life. As they pulled out of the station, snow still falling around them, Daniel glanced at the rearview mirror. The station lights glowed against the storm, and in the distance, just beyond the tree line, a dark figure watched them go. They were leaving just in time. But the hunt wasn't over yet. The old off-road truck rumbled through the snow-covered forest, its heavy tires grinding against the ice-packed dirt road. The storm had finally eased, leaving behind an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of trees weighed down by frost. Daniel kept his hands firm on the wheel, eyes scanning the narrow path ahead, every nerve in his body taut. Beside him, Tess sat with a map unfolded on her lap, occasionally glancing at the wolves resting in the back. The larger one was awake, alert, watching the world pass beyond the frost-covered glass. The smaller wolf remained curled up beneath the blankets, its chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. They were alive, but they weren't safe yet. "We're about 40 miles from the sanctuary," Tess said, tracing a gloved finger along the map. "If we keep up this pace, we'll be there before sunrise." Daniel nodded, but didn't look away from the road. "And if they're following us?" Tess hesitated. "Then we'll know soon enough." The weight of her words settled between them. They both knew the truth. The men hunting these wolves wouldn't just give up. The trees thickened as they climbed into the higher elevations. The road twisted sharply, flanked by steep slopes on either side. Snow draped over the branches, reflecting the dim glow of the truck's headlights. Daniel checked the rearview mirror. Nothing, but that didn't mean they weren't out there. Tess tapped the map. "We'll be hitting a frozen river in about 10 miles. If we can get across, it'll put us beyond any easy tracking routes." Daniel exhaled through his nose. "Unless they already know where we're going." She didn't reply. They both knew it was a possibility. Then, the larger wolf lifted its head sharply, ears twitching. A low, warning growl rumbled from its throat. Daniel's stomach tightened. He flicked his eyes to the mirror just in time to see the first set of headlights crest the distant ridge behind them. Tess sucked in a breath. "Damn it! 2 vehicles, maybe 3, moving fast." "They found us," Daniel muttered, his grip tightening on the wheel. Tess turned, her face illuminated by the red glow of the taillights. "What do we do?" Daniel slammed his foot down on the gas. The truck lurched forward, kicking up a thick spray of snow behind them. The engine roared as they skidded around a sharp curve, barely clinging to the narrow road. The wolves held their ground in the back, the larger one bracing itself, muscles tensed, as if preparing for a fight. Tess grabbed onto the dashboard. "Daniel, hold on." The first set of headlights closed in fast. A gunshot cracked through the night. The side mirror exploded into shards of glass. Daniel swore, jerking the wheel hard left, just as another bullet whizzed past the truck, embedding itself into the metal siding. Tess was already reaching for the rifle strapped to the floor. She loaded a round with smooth efficiency, then rolled down the window just enough to get a clear shot. She took a deep breath, then fired. The muzzle flash lit up the night. The first pursuing vehicle swerved violently, tires skidding against the ice-packed road. Daniel saw it clip the edge of the embankment, losing control. The headlights tilted wildly as the car plunged sideways, disappearing into the trees with a deafening crash. One down, but the others weren't stopping. The remaining vehicle pushed forward, gaining speed, its driver clearly more experienced, more determined. Daniel saw his chance. "Hang on," he barked, jerking the wheel. The truck veered off the main road, cutting through a narrow side trail, barely wide enough to fit. Branches slashed against the windows, snow spraying up in thick waves. Tess twisted in her seat, watching as the pursuing vehicle skidded hard, nearly missing the turn. Daniel smirked. "That'll slow them down." Then his eyes flicked forward, and his stomach dropped. A frozen river stretched ahead of them, its surface gleaming like polished steel in the moonlight. No bridge, no second chances. Tess realized it at the same time. "Daniel, I see it!" Behind them, the pursuers were closing in. They had no choice. Daniel gunned the engine. The tires hit the ice with a sickening slide. The entire truck lurched sideways, skidding uncontrollably across the frozen surface. The wolves yelped as the sled they were in bounced with the impact. Daniel fought the wheel, heart hammering, trying to keep them straight. Behind them, their pursuers hesitated for half a second. Then the lead vehicle made the mistake of following. The ice groaned beneath the weight of the second truck. Tess glanced back. Her breath caught in her throat. Come on, Daniel muttered. They were almost across, then a deafening crack. The ice beneath their pursuer's truck gave way. A sudden plunge, water exploding upward as the entire vehicle dropped into the freezing abyss. Tess gasped. Daniel didn't slow down. The second they reached solid ground, he punched the gas, pulling them onto the opposite embankment. The remaining vehicle screeched to a halt, its driver smart enough not to take the risk. For the first time that night, Daniel allowed himself to exhale. They had made it. The sanctuary came into view just before dawn, a massive expanse of untouched forest surrounded by protected land, a place where no hunter could set foot. The truck rumbled to a stop in front of the main lodge, where a handful of workers were already waiting. Tess jumped out first, waving them over. Daniel opened the truck bed, carefully lowering the sled. The larger wolf stood first, scanning its new surroundings. It turned, glancing at Daniel one last time before stepping away, toward the safety of the trees. The smaller wolf was carried inside for treatment, but Daniel knew it would survive now. Tess turned to him, smiling. They're free, Daniel nodded. He watched as the larger wolf stopped at the tree line, staring back at him. A long moment passed. Then, with a final flick of its tail, it vanished into the wild. Gone, where it belonged. Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He should have felt relief, but instead he felt something else. Because out there, beyond the sanctuary's borders, the stranger was still watching. And Daniel knew this wasn't over. Not yet.